Hey everyone, Connor here with you from The World Divide. Today we're going to talk about the Russo-Ukraine War, November 5th. I'll give a general kind of frontline update and then I'll talk about kind of the situation, bigger picture. Not too much to cover frontline, so this part should be relatively quick. We're still seeing troop buildup um, and equipment buildup in Belarus, the Kursk regions, Belgorod. Um, so all of that is still kind of going as planned. No changes there. If we start to move into like the occupied or the gained territories of Russia, starting east of Kharkiv, east of the Oskol River, what I like to call the Svatova line. There hasn't been really many changes there. The Ukrainians have been active in that region. They do have a lot of forces in that region, and they've been trying to probe and find Russian weaknesses along that line of contact. And they've had some successes, some like really small successes. But so have the Russians. The Russians have been able to counterattack in some areas, putting pressure on Ukraine. So it's really unclear kind of where that situation lies right now, but overall there's not too much movement. And going further south, if we look at our Bakhmut conglomeration, um, it's really unknown what's happening there. It's one of those front lines where there's a lot of fog of war. There's other front lines like that as well. Um, but as we know right now, that front line has stalled. Russian forces, Wagner PMC forces, have been pushing very hard in that region. Um, Less so of a hook to the north to encircle Bakhmut from that angle, but to push further to the south. So Russian forces were able a couple weeks ago to push and capture Ivanograd, Opitne, which are suburbs of Bakhmut directly south. Um, I think there's still battles ongoing in Opitna. It's not exactly clear where the Russian lines are currently. Um, but one thing I do know is that likely their main objective next is going to be Kurdumivka, which is a town a little bit south of Bakhmut. But what would happen is if the Russians were able to take Kurdumivka, they'd be able to move their forces in between many vital road junctions, one of them being Bakhmut, another one being Konstantinivka, and also the New York conglomeration. They'd be able to put pressure on all three at once and have fire control over all the roads leading to every place. Now, the place that would struggle the most would certainly be Bakhmut, because they would have fire control of the road that runs west-east for many miles. So I believe that if they were able to take Kurdumivka and drive hard in this empty space in between all these vital roads, that they'd be able to collapse Bakhmut and Seversk, rolling pretty far up the line. We saw this with Popasno during the Severodonetsk-Lysychansk operation, where it took months to take Popasno. It took months. When the Russians were able to take Popasno, they flowered out. They were able to cause more pressure. Now it's not quite the same situation here. I think the Russians will be able to take Kurdumivka a lot quicker than they were able to take Popasna. Um, but it will have resounding results, and I think Ukrainians are going to be putting effort in trying to hold Kurdumivka. Moving further south to Donetsk, our Donetsk line, most heavily fortified line on the entire front. So the only real progress has been happening in two different places. So around Pishki, one of the main drives, of course, the encirclement of Avdiivka, the linchpin in Ukrainian defense throughout their entire defense. If Avdiivka falls, it cuts their lines in half. And they don't have another location nearly as fortified as Avdiivka. So it's been a huge Russian objective to encircle Avdiivka to alleviate pressure from Donetsk city. So Russians have made progress. They have captured a town called Vadian, which is just north of Pishki, and they've been pushing up from Pishki as well to Pervomaisk. Pishki is one of those towns as well, just like the Popasna example that I brought up earlier, where now the Russians are flowering out of Pishki. Um, One of the things that I'm currently watching is that is if the Russians are able to continue this pressure, and if they are able to secure control over Pervomaisk, running all the way to Vadian and Opitna, if they're able to secure those towns, they're only a couple towns away from putting Avdiivka itself in tactical encirclement. So this is definitely something I'm going to be watching over the next few days, but nothing really confirmed yet. It's a lot of fog of war in this region as well. Moving further south, there has been some gains in Marinka, just maybe a street or two, but still very important. The Russians claim that they're putting pressure on the road that runs north-south through Marinka, which would be quite important for another place that the Russians are pushing further south, the Ugledar conglomeration. Now, it was believed that the Russians had captured up to 60% of Pavlovka. I also heard information that there was a Ukrainian counteroffensive down there. It's hard to verify anything right now because that is a region where there's a lot of there's high activity and the Russians are pushing hard. One of the challenges the Russians are facing right now is just the weather, the autumn weather. The grounds haven't quite gotten hardened up yet, so everything's really muddy. It's really difficult for large offensive movements into, logistics, things of that nature. So that is one of the factors slowing down the Russian offensive. And plus, the Ukrainians have sent reserves to hold the Russians back, so it's unclear where things are at the moment. But it's believed that the Russians, for now, are stalled down in that region. Running along the rest of the Zaporozhye front line, things are pretty stagnant. And then we go over to the Kherson region. There's not many specifically like troop movements or anything like that. More or less, there's a lot of troops on both sides in that region. Heavy buildups, heavy buildups. Both sides have evacuated the prospective cities. Russian-controlled Kherson has been evacuated. The Ukrainians are evacuating Mykolaiv. And it looks as if the Russians want the Ukrainians to start a counteroffensive. They're in comfortable defensive positions right now. After a Ukrainian counteroffensive in northern Kherson region, the Russians actually withdrew from part of the region, running along the Dnieper River, and moved south to better prepared defensive positions. The entirety of the Kherson region is being heavily fortified by Russia. They want to use this as a military checkpoint, a launching point for future operations. So that's the way things are right now. Mobilized forces are still being moved in. We're just waiting. So an important day to mark on your calendars, November 8th, midterm elections for the United States. We'll get to kind of see whether the Senate and the House are either gonna stay Democratic dominant or become Republican dominant. Now, there has been a lot of sentiment on the Republican side in U.S. politics about our support for Ukraine. The further right you go, the less and less that support kind of extends. You're starting to see more and more people kind of talk about openly seizing all funding of the Ukraine war. So as far as offensive operations go from the Russian perspective, I think they'll want to wait and see the results of the midterm elections, as well as wait for that good weather to come, for the ground to get hard, and this is something that I heard from the Military Summary channel. I'd recommend following him. That during the early winter period, there is a fog event that happens in Ukraine. And that during that fog event, it becomes very hard to see anything. And that it would be cold around this time, and this would be a good time. The ground would harden. You'd have this heavy fog. the Ukrainians won't be able to see where the Russians are coming from. Of course, it's vice versa. But at this point, the Russians would have number superiority. The Ukrainians want to mobilize more as well. We're talking of force count of around 100,000 troops. I have a feeling they can't really muster up many more reservists. We've had some numbers coming in on Ukrainian casualties. Round estimates are around 100,000 dead, 400, 500,000 wounded, which are catastrophic numbers. And less, it looks like the Ukrainians are really running through their reserves. And Russia, throughout this entire war, has been able to maintain a very positive casualty ratio with Ukraine because they haven't been pursuing a strategy of holding every inch of territory. They just hold what's strategically necessary and they retreat if it's not worth it. And they've always been trying to kind of spare their troops, which is why they have such a favorable casualty ratio. It's also equipment advantage, artillery advantage. There's a lot of advantages on the Russian side. So they're utilizing them, and the pain will be felt when this offensive starts. Presumably November, December. Now, there has been talk on the western side, particularly from General Patrushev from the United States, of a coalition of the willing moving into Ukraine to support this war. Coalition of the willing. What does that imply? Well, it implies any forces from Europe, any people from Europe who want to get involved in the war, not as NATO, but as a coalition of the willing, right, would get involved and make up some of the reserve losses that Ukraine has faced. You're not going to see much support in the United States, Western Europe, although presumably there may be U.S. troops because there has been a force buildup in Eastern Europe for quite a while now. But we're going to probably see countries like Poland, maybe Slovakia, definitely not Hungary. Hungary's been a lot more reluctant to press sanctions against Russia, or do things that would hurt its energy security because it has a high dependence on Russian oil and gas. But Romania would also be another good candidate for a coalition of the willing. But expect with all of this coming together that you could probably scrape around 150,000 troops to move into Ukraine to help support, which is not insignificant, but it's not enough. And the thing is, you'd have to muster that, you'd have to coordinate that, and with that, you would escalate the war. You'd escalate the war much further. I mean, when offensive operations start, let's be real, we're going to see Russians, numbering 700,000 troops, near the end of November. That number will increase to around 1 million in January, with the rate that they've been mobilizing units. So you have to kind of wonder, when will Ukraine break? When will Ukraine break? You're not seeing this kind of be talked about on Western media. There's the constant portrayal that we are winning, the Ukraine is winning this war, or whatever. I'm sorry, I don't see any evidence of that. I've been following this conflict on a daily basis since the war broke out. I've been following it on a daily basis, looking at Western sources, Russian sources, mediating sources, talks, things of that nature. And Ukraine just doesn't have it. I mean, Russia has inflicted massive damage to Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Currently, there's a 10-day shutdown period every single day in Ukraine where there's completely no power for anyone. This makes it harder for, the West likes to call it just act of, barbaric insanity. They like to call it, you know, like fear stoking, things of that nature. But it really does also have a military purpose too, because both sides throughout the entire war have been relying on rail transport to get heavy equipment, to get troops around the line very quickly. And those rail lines are powered by electricity. And what do you do if you don't have that power? Well, you can use diesel engines, but those are also being targeted. So both sides do depend on electricity to just move equipment, troops around in this operation. And if you look at the rail distances that each side has to transport troops, Ukraine has a significant advantage. I mean, think of it. Russia is wrapped around Ukraine like this. They have a land bridge from Crimea to mainland Russia, but there's no rail connection through there. If Russia wants to send troops to either the Kherson region or Zaporozhye, they have to make a large hook from the Rostov-on-Don region south through Crimea, across the Kerch Bridge, across the strait, through Crimea, up into Ukraine. It's 4 times the distance that the Ukrainians have to travel. So it is in Russia's best interest to take out Ukraine's energy infrastructure, to suck the will from the Ukrainian people, and to start taking this war more seriously, which is what, you know, we're seeing Russia do. We're seeing Russia change their stance. We're seeing, you know, heightened rhetoric. You know, none of this can really go in a good direction. And, you know, I still hear talks now of, you know, if Ukraine can take all the territories that were taken from them, they can take Crimea, they could start like, what makes you think that these ideas are malleable, that are even possible? Just looking at what's happening on the ground, it dumbfounds me that there's still people chanting that Ukraine is forcing the Russians back, Ukraine's going to win. That's a possibility, because it's simply ludicrous that, you know, that things would be that way. But that's all that's kind of happening right now. I'm sure more is going to happen, especially after midterms elections. So November 8th is the day to look at. But that's all for today. Thank you guys. See you again soon.